The reputation you develop for intellectual and ethical integrity will be your greatest asset, worst enemy.
It was July 20th, 1993, 6 months to the day after Bill Clinton assumed the office of President of the United States. Deputy White House Counsel Vincent Foster Jr. was found dead at 6 p.m. in Fort Marcy Park, just outside of Washington, D.C. Before Foster's body had even cooled, the national media had already pronounced suicide as the cause of death. Clinton himself confirmed the media's ruling, ignoring the fact that investigations were still in preliminary stages and therefore inconclusive. It would be another 6 months before anyone in the mainstream media would seriously begin investigating for themselves the circumstances surrounding Foster's death. Bill Clinton and Vince Foster were childhood friends who grew up together in Arkansas. Young Foster excelled in everything he did, becoming a star athlete and senior class president, graduating first in his class at Arkansas Law School, and receiving the highest marks on his state bar exams for the year. He became a senior partner at the powerful Rose Law Firm in Little Rock, where he practiced alongside Hillary Clinton and Webb Hubbell. Despite objections from his wife, Lisa, Foster accepted Clinton's request to become Deputy White House Counsel and followed his lifelong friend to Washington. The American people might have shown more interest in Foster's death had they realized one thing. He was the highest-ranking federal official to die under questionable circumstances since John F. Kennedy. From the outset, the investigation into the death of Vince Foster has been marred by controversy. At Bill Clinton and Attorney General Janet Reno's insistence, responsibility for the investigation was turned over to the Park Police, even though Foster's death fell within the jurisdiction of the FBI. Not until his death had sufficiently developed into a full-fledged scandal 7 months later would the FBI be allowed in. The results of the FBI's investigation, along with the findings of the Park Police and coroner, were incorporated into a report issued by Special Counsel Robert Fisk. The report, released June 30th, 1994, confirmed suicide as the cause of death. However, a careful examination of key pieces of evidence taken directly from the report itself indicate a number of alarming contradictions inconsistent with the report's own conclusion that Foster took his life. Sergeant George Gonzalez, a lead paramedic for the Fairfax County Fire and Rescue, was first on the scene after responding to a 911 call. Gonzalez, a 13-year veteran, had previously examined a number of suicide victims with gunshot wounds to the head. He was shocked by the obvious lack of blood at the scene, stating, "Usually a suicide by gunshot is a mess." His observations were confirmed by many others who were present, including members of the Park Police. Christopher Ruddy, who at the time was a reporter for the New York Post, had discovered that most of those on the scene that night had never been interviewed, an oversight which he quickly began to correct.
In January of 1994, I went down and met with some of the emergency workers and police that were at the scene that night, and I found out that many of them were surprised about the body and the condition when they found it. For example, the lead paramedic who was at the scene that night noted that he had never seen a suicide like this, gunshot wound to the head, with so little blood.
Gene Wheaton, a retired U.S. Special Agent with the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, has more than 35 years' experience as a homicide investigator. He spent several weeks in Washington investigating the Foster case.
I was hired to specifically go to Washington and make some inquiries into the circumstances surrounding the death of White House legal counsel Vincent Foster. It is my professional opinion, and I've been a homicide investigator for 35, 40 years, that the events surrounding the death were treated in such a cavalier and bizarre manner that it had to have been a cover-up. I have never in my career seen a gunshot wound into the mouth by a suicide that didn't have a tremendous amount of blowback of blood, brains, and tissue, both in the out of the mouth and the nose, the ears, and the back of the skull at the exit wound. It's a very sloppy, gory sight to see. And when a person fires a .38 caliber revolver, which the alleged weapon was, or higher caliber than that, there's a tremendous amount of gases that have no place to go inside the skull cavity, and it just blows everything out. For them to say that there was a very minor amount of blood at the scene, which is what's in the official reports, I find it hard to believe. It doesn't make any professional sense.
The Fisk report attempts to explain away the lack of blood by stating that the bullet contused the left side of the brainstem, causing instantaneous complete incapacitation, including the immediate stopping of the heart and blood flow. Noted California pathologist and gunshot wound expert Dr. Richard Mason disagrees, stating, "Certainly you can have heart activity for a minute or two following brainstem impairment." Page 52 of the Fisk report states, Foster's body was positioned on a steep slope with his head near the top of the berm and his legs extended down the hill. As a result, when his heart stopped beating, gravity permitted the settling of blood into the lower portions of his body rather than out of the wound in his head. This statement contradicts an earlier statement on page 36 where Fisk writes, "At approximately 7:40 p.m., Dr. Donald Houck, the Fairfax County medical examiner, arrived at the scene to examine the body. At that point, Foster's body was rolled over, and those present observed a large pool of blood located on the ground where Foster's head had been. Dr. Houck, who was never interviewed by Fisk, vehemently denies seeing a large pool of blood on the ground." EMS technician Corey Ashford, who placed Foster's remains into a body bag, re-emphasized the lack of blood by stating he couldn't even see an exit wound. This statement led to initial reports that there was no exit wound.
The person that put Foster's body in a body bag later that night, an EMS worker, said that he didn't even have to use rubber gloves. He didn't remember even seeing an exit wound out of the back of Foster's head, and he didn't even have to wash his hands after doing this task.
This important testimony, which further reinforced the lack of blood at the scene, was omitted from the report.
The FBI did an analysis of blood tracks on Foster's head, and what they found was very interesting. There were 4 different blood tracks on Foster's head indicating that even though he had died instantly, which means he's not moaning or groaning on the ground, his head had assumed 4 separate positions.
The park police said they realized that this was a problem, but they just ignored it. They didn't deal with it. They didn't mention it in their report. They told me that they realized it was a problem, but they never discussed it. The Fisk, the pathologists, on the other hand, they recognized that this was a problem that had to be addressed. So they addressed it by saying that we conclude that one of the early observers on the scene moved the head. Now, they didn't say they had any evidence of that. They just said we conclude that because the head had been moved, and how else could it have been moved? I mean, some of the paramedic or somebody, when he checked the pulse, he probably straightened out the head. Well, the paramedic denies that he did that.
The official coroner's report depicts a large gaping 1-inch exit wound located 3 inches below the crown of Foster's head. According to Fisk, the area surrounding the body at the park was meticulously searched to a depth of 18 inches, but no brain tissue or skull fragments were found.
Another oddity that has never been explained of the crime scene is the failure of anybody during the crime scene search to find the large skull fragments that were blown out of the back of Foster's head. They didn't just disappear in thin air. They should have been right there on the ground around the body. And there's been no explanation as to why they weren't there. And the most logical explanation is either they were picked up and destroyed, or the body was moved from another location.
Analysis of this lack of crucial evidence was again omitted by Fisk, apparently because it did not support his conclusion of the suicide occurring in the park.
There's a tremendous amount of recoil when a pistol of that caliber is fired. In my career of investigating many hundreds of violent deaths, I cannot recall ever finding a large caliber pistol still remaining in the victim's hand after his death.
Typically, in the case of a suicide, the gun is not in the person's hand, and some cases can be thrown by a reflex action in the arm some distance. In Foster's case, it was found almost neatly at his side, the thumb still on the trigger.
People don't die like they do on television. They flop their arms around, and I've seen weapons thrown 30, 40 feet away from the body of a suicide, but I've never found one still in the hand.
The Fisk report repeatedly states that the gun was found in Foster's right hand. Normally, this would not require further explanation, except in this case. Foster was left-handed, and nowhere in the report is this fact mentioned.
It is illogical to think that the man would have shot himself using his right hand. I have even been told that he was almost non-functional in his right hand because he was such a seriously left-handed person. If, on the other hand, this was a staged suicide scene, it would have been the normal assumption that he was right-handed, because the vast majority of people are, and therefore the weapon would have been placed in his right hand.
An FBI analysis found none of Foster's fingerprints on the gun, despite the fact the gun was found in Foster's hand. Page 46 of the Fisk report attempts to explain this contradiction by suggesting that latent prints can be destroyed by certain elements, such as heat. However, the FBI did make one extraordinary discovery. One latent fingerprint was visible on the underside of the right pistol grip, approximately 2 inches from the base of the grip. This print did not belong to Foster. No attempt was made to determine the identity of the person whose print was found on the gun's hand grip.
The Fisk report says there was gunpowder residue on the right index finger, the web of the right hand, and then the right thumb. There was also gunpowder residue on the left index finger. What they also say is something interesting, that the only place that this gunpowder residue could have come from was from the front cylinder gap of the revolver, up near the barrel of the gun. Now, anyone that knows anything about guns knows that you don't put your hand against the cylinder of the gun. It's not the grip of a deliberate suicide.
The fact that he had powder burns on both index fingers indicates something very, very fishy. Both hands would have had to have been over the cylinder gap. That's the gap between, at the front of the cylinder, between the cylinder and the barrel of the gun. Now you can imagine him shooting himself. He's got both hands up here. no grip on the butt of the gun itself. That is very, very, very difficult and unlikely to happen.
Even though Fisk insists that Foster killed himself, leading forensic experts from around the country now agree that given the position of the gunpowder residue on Foster's fingers, it is highly unlikely he pulled the trigger himself. Gunpowder was found on Foster's clothing, which did not match the gun found in his hand. Fisk speculated that gunpowder of a different type was accidentally blown onto Foster's clothing by an exhaust fan in the Park Police Laboratory. However, once again, Fisk was not able to support this theory with any evidence. The Colt .38 revolver found in Foster's hand has yet to be positively identified as belonging to Foster. Foster's 3 adult-aged children all stated that the gun found in his hand was not the one they had seen at home. According to his wife, Foster kept only one gun, which she found in their house the night of his death.
The gun that's found in his hand is a 1913 Colt Special, Army Special, and made up of the parts of 2 different guns. The last transaction which it was registered was 1913. It's untraceable.
That is the classic type of a weapon that's untraceable, used by professional political assassins and organized crime hitmen to kill somebody when they're going to leave the weapon behind and make it look like suicide.
And only 2 bullets, one of which was expended and one of which was still in the cartridge. And no bullets, no ammo for this gun found in Foster's house. So he goes out to commit suicide, ostensibly, with this untraceable weapon, with only 2 bullets. The only 2 he had.
Did he go out and just buy 3 or 4 bullets? You know, you buy a box of bullets if you're going to have a pistol. And if he's going to have a pistol in his home for protection while he's in Washington, he would have had a box of rounds of the same brand, caliber, so forth. But none were found other than the ones that were in the pistol. This is a classic assassination type scenario.
One of the most crucial pieces of crime scene evidence, the fatal bullet, has yet to be found. A thorough FBI search of the area, which even uncovered artifacts dating back to the Civil War, yielded over 70 pieces of metal, including 12 modern-day bullets. Yet, none of them matched the gun found in Foster's hand. No gunshot was reported by anyone in the area. Page 56 of the Fisk report attempts to explain that, in addition to possible traffic and construction noise, the sound of the shot would have been further muffled by Foster shooting the gun inside his mouth.
That is an illogical statement, because most of the explosive noise of a revolver of that caliber going off is expended around the cylinder and the strap of the weapon where the bullet is discharged. There should have been a loud report.
Against standard police procedure, not one resident living nearby was ever contacted during the investigation to find out if a gunshot was heard. Page 12 of the FBI mineralogy report indicates Foster's shoes did not contain coherent soil. In other words, not one microscopic piece of dust was found on them.
He gets out of his car and allegedly walks 600 feet through the park, through this heavily wooded park, and according to an FBI analysis, there was not a trace of soil on his shoes or clothing, which I think is a feat that would be impossible to occur.
Journalists who retraced the path Fisk claims Foster took through the park found their shoes covered with dust.
Clearly, there's a lot of evidence that the body was moved. The fact that there was not a trace of soil on his shoes or clothing indicates that he likely didn't walk in that park.
Nothing at that crime scene makes sense. And nobody has questioned this officially. That's the most bizarre factor in this whole case. I can't understand why the national media and congressional committees don't have a stronger reaction to an obviously phony, flawed, fake investigation and final report.
Each time the Fisk investigators came across one of these unusual occurrences, it was just dismissed out of hand or given the most tenuous of explanations.
Despite Fisk's insistence that the overwhelming weight of the evidence compels the conclusion that Vincent Foster committed suicide in Fort Marcy Park on July 20th, 1993, an examination of the 12 pieces of evidence presented thus far indicates otherwise. 6 pieces of evidence indicate that Foster more than likely did not die in the park and was moved to that location. 3 pieces of evidence indicate that Foster more than likely did not fire the gun himself, while 3 pieces of evidence indicate the death was staged to appear to be a suicide.
If you take the entire scenario of Vince Foster's death and you take each portion of it and put it together, there are so many circumstantial things. There's a preponderance of circumstantial evidence indicating he did not commit suicide.
In addition, the FBI found other key pieces of evidence on Foster's clothing, including his underwear, consisting of multicolored carpet fibers, semen, and long blonde hair.
The FBI did a suction analysis of Foster's clothing and underwear. They found carpet fibers of various colors all over this man's very expensive clothing. Now, Fort Marcy isn't carpeted, and I don't think a man like Vincent Foster rolls on carpets in the middle of the afternoon. Was there a carpet in contact with his body before he died? It's a question, or was the carpet somehow involved in the movement of the body? These are questions that should have been asked. The FBI investigators that testified before the Senate Banking Committee said something interesting. They were asked about the unusual hairs and carpet fibers on Foster's body. And they said, well, that these things were there, but they could be anything. So, they dismissed it out of hand.
The Fisk report mentioned only the carpet fibers and the hair. And they said that this is something the FBI found, but they indicated there's no indication that any effort had been made to find out whose hair it was, where the carpet fibers came from. They just mentioned it was found. They didn't mention anything about the semen.
This evidence could have provided clues as to Foster's whereabouts between 1 p.m., when he left the White House, and 6 p.m., when his body was discovered. Yet this evidence was never investigated. From the very beginning, a number of serious cover-ups have plagued the Foster investigation. One such controversy surrounds the falsified location of the body. 2 Civil War-era cannons are on display in Fort Marcy Park. The first is on the southwest side of the park, while the second is on the northeast side near the rear. Several officials who were on the scene all specifically place Foster's body a little over 20 yards past the first cannon. However, the official police report, as well as the Fisk report, for some unknown reason, place the body directly in front of the second cannon on the northeast side.
They told the press and the public, and in their official reports, that the body was actually some distance from the parking lot, approximately 600 feet directly in front of an area known as the second cannon, a cannon deep in the rear of the park.
There were 2 cannons in that park, and there's strong indications that the crime scene was moved from a location near Cannon 1 to a location near cannon number 2 to fit the scenario that they were trying to force on the public to believe it was a suicide.
There's a number of pieces of evidence. The first is that one of the people I talked to, the paramedic that was first on the scene that night, drew me a map. And he told me how he and 2 other rescue personnel, a police officer and another emergency worker ran from the parking lot up into the main clearing of this earthen fort, and that he went to the left in the main clearing of the fort, past what is known as the first cannon, and he said that the body was lying on that hill past the first cannon.
The map sketched by Sergeant Gonzalez for Ruddy, showing the location of the body, coincides with a map sketched by medical examiner Dr. Donald Hout for Irvine.
He drew me a map to show me precisely where the body was, and it was a map that showed, put the body some 50 feet or so away from the first cannon. Not in direct line with the cannon, but off to the left of the cannon. The map was quite precise, sketched out, but he said there was no doubt that which cannon it was. And because of the map he drew and because of his certainty about it, it seemed to me that this is fairly strong evidence that there has indeed been some kind of cover-up or deception going on about the location of the body.
To verify the location, reporters asked to view photos of the crime scene and were informed there were none. This led to initial reports that no photos had been taken. Later, the park police reluctantly revealed that 35mm photos had indeed been taken, but had, quote, accidentally been underexposed during processing.
There should be no dispute as to where the body was in the park, because every investigation of this type, the most elemental thing you need, the police should do, is take crime scene photos. Photos of the whole crime scene, and photos that show the relationship of where the body was to other landmarks such as cannons or his car in the park. Well, the park police don't have those photos. I reported in March in the New York Post that they didn't have the photos. They have 13 Polaroids, but they're all close-up shots. We learned in the Fisk report that the park police claim they took these crime scene photos, but that they were underexposed in the park police labs and were totally useless.
A 10-year-old child can take pictures with a 35mm camera, and a trained technician will automatically have that camera set properly, and they said that the film was all underexposed, which makes no sense. But they also took Polaroid shots, but they never took any shots of the entire scene. They just took close-up shots of his body, and that is against all procedure, training, regulations in photographing a crime scene.
To head off growing criticism that the White House was engaged in a massive cover-up, ABC News released one of the surviving Polaroids in March of 1994. The plan to exonerate the White House, however, may have backfired, since the photo depicted foliage around the body, contradicting the official location near the second cannon, which is all dirt.
It's interesting, if you look at that photograph, you see a lot of foliage and leaves and vegetation around the body. In the area where the paramedic and the police officer and other testimony indicates the body was found, by the first cannon area, the photograph is absolutely consistent with that area. If you go up to the site where they claim they found the body, the second cannon area directly in front of that is where they claim they found the body, you'll find all dirt.
On the night of Foster's death, a second crime scene was fraudulently created at the site of the second cannon, complete with phony blood stain and rubber technician gloves gratuitously strewn about. Members of the media who arrived the next morning at the park were led to believe this was where the body was actually found. Because the photo's depiction of brown leaves and foliage around the body was inconsistent with the second cannon site, journalists who viewed the site originally believed the photo was fraudulent. However, it appears now the photo is genuine, while the official statement regarding the body's location is a lie.
One of the most important things that the police should try to find in a situation or death like this is the bullet. It allegedly went through Foster's head. Most forensic experts say that the bullet should fall somewhere in the vicinity of the body. It loses a lot of its momentum after it goes through the skull and the cranium. The park police originally told me that they didn't even do a metal detector sweep for the bullet, which is a standard thing that police are supposed to do because the bullet got, quote, lost in the woods, unquote. After the negative press came out about that, The police then said that they did a metal detector sweep, and they have a report. Fisk's investigators go back up there with FBI agents, again using sophisticated metal detectors, in the vicinity of where the police say they searched, and they find 70 pieces of metal, 12 modern-day bullets, none being the bullet that was fired allegedly through Foster's head. What this means is that no one really went through with a metal detector in the area that the Park Police claimed that they searched very thoroughly.
On page 56 of his report, Fisk writes, "It would have been enormously time-consuming, costly, and, in all likelihood, unproductive to have searched the entire park for the bullet." Fisk's use of the word unproductive is revealing. Could he have known ahead of time the bullet would not be found? After being notified about the discovery of Foster's body, the White House immediately demanded possession of key crime scene evidence, to the point of even threatening to break into the chief investigator's locker if necessary to get it. Against all standard procedures, the Park Police willingly obliged.
Well, again, people are surprised with the White House, but I guess President Clinton wanted to give these things to Mrs. Foster, present them in a way, personal friends, and they were going to break my desk open to get that key, to get the evidence out of the locker, until I remembered that I had another key.
And that didn't surprise or shock you at all that night?
I wasn't happy about my desk being going to be broken and open, but it didn't surprise me that the White House sent somebody down there, and one way or another they were going to get that. That didn't surprise me. Whether they had to come and pick me up and bring me in there, or they're going to break my desk open, it didn't surprise me.
They gave the crime scene evidence away within hours of Foster's death. He was found at 6 o'clock. He was officially identified at 8:30, and they admitted that within hours of the official identification, they returned Foster's White House beeper. That would have had critical information possibly stored in it. It also would have had possibly latent fingerprints on it that would have been very critical. Why was it so critical and urgent for the White House to get a $100 pager back that was part of a crime scene?
Yeah, it's proper procedure. I called them up. They wanted to come down and get it, and I turned it over to them after I recorded the information that I needed to get from it. I had no further use for it because there was nothing to say this was anything other than a suicide.
So it's your opinion then, when you gave up this pager, that it was really unimportant?
Right. At that time, I didn't think of it. Honest, and why? Again, this was a suicide investigation.
I think it would be safe to assume this was not proper procedure at a homicide. Now, I don't want to put you on the spot, Mr. Moore. I'm going to say, do you think that was proper procedure to turn in the pager without ascertaining if it was a Bravo or a Bravo Plus and had the ability to store messages even if it was found closed? Are you going to say that was proper, that was normal? Would the FBI have done that under normal circumstances? Yes or no?
No. If we had had jurisdiction on this case, yes, we would have taken that pager and reviewed it, sir.
The next day, the White House demanded from the Park Police, and the Park Police acquiesced and gave away other critical crime scene evidence, the personal belongings and papers that were found on Foster's body and car.
If I was going to select the least professional federal law enforcement agency in the United States to conduct a homicide investigation, it would be the Park Police.
Now, is it difficult for you to tell us whether the Park Service, for any reason, I don't know the reason now, but for any reason, conducted this investigation or failed to conduct it, coerced or otherwise, in a way that you consider to be the best possible investigative procedures?
Obviously, we used the results of their investigation.
No, wait a minute. I'm asking you a question.
Yes, sir.
Is it impossible for you to share with us your expertise about whether they did or didn't?
I think they did an adequate job, okay. Senator. I just feel inappropriate to evaluate another agency's work.
One of the most serious aspects of the Foster case is the fact that the FBI was kept out of the Foster investigation. This investigation of a leading federal official was given to the less experienced U.S. Park Police, whose main duties include traffic control and traffic tickets and monitoring the parks in and around Washington, D.C. certainly they're not equipped as the FBI would be in such an important case.
The man was one of President Clinton's closest confidants and lifetime friends, as well as the number 2 legal counsel to the president in the White House. And to leave the investigation of a violent death to a Park Police Agency instead of calling in the FBI immediately is unconscionable, and I've never heard it happening in my life.
What the law says is a killing or assault on a high government official shall be investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the FBI was required by law to investigate because Foster was a high government official.
Just 24 hours before Foster's death, Bill Clinton made history by becoming the first president ever to fire the head of the FBI. William Sessions had agreed to resign once a replacement had been confirmed, a procedure which may have taken only a few weeks. But this was unacceptable to Clinton.
William Sessions himself has charged in a written statement earlier this year that his firing the day before led to a, quote, compromised, unquote, investigation into the Foster death. It's a very, very serious allegation.
William Romer, former head of the FBI's Organized Crime Strike Force, added that Reno and Clinton had undue influence over the FBI's involvement in the Foster investigation. Ironically, it was none other than Robert Fisk who suggested to Clinton that he fire Sessions and replace him with Louis Freeh.
For the FBI not to have exerted its authority to go in there immediately and assume control of that investigation means that the new FBI director, a presidential appointee, had to have ordered his investigators, his special agents, not to conduct an investigation.
Given these legal justifications for the FBI to have been and should have been the lead investigative agency, why were the Park Police in charge of the investigation?
So the FBI was notified of this, they reviewed it, and they found no evidence of foul play, anything other than a suicide, and they left it to us.
In addition to Clinton's unprecedented rush to label Foster's death as suicide, the national news media fell in line as well, skipping over any possibility of homicide as the cause of death. Even the Park Police got caught up in the frenzy, officially ruling suicide as the cause of death prior to conducting a ballistics test on the gun.
The Park Police didn't test the gun until August 12th. They sent it for testing on August 12th. They already ruled officially that it was a suicide on August 10th. So 2 days later, they're deciding that they're going to test the gun.
The reason police investigate suicides is to eliminate the possibility of murder, and they didn't do that in this case. They just went in and wrote it up as a suicide. You always have to approach a suicide as a homicide investigation and eliminate homicide before you call it a suicide.
When we arrived at the scene and I went up to the scene, everything was consistent with a suicide.
Mm-hmm. Everything was consistent with a suicide. What would your answer be, Mr. Rolla?
And pretty much the same. Again, it was the early stages of investigation, just arriving on the scene. But at that point, everything was consistent with a suicide.
Mm-hmm. The Park Police concluded fairly quickly, within a matter of, I would say, 24 to 48 hours, that this was clearly a suicide. And they had substantial evidence, I believe, to support that conclusion.
The period of time, the time that they made a decision, I don't know the exact time, but it wasn't too far past the time of the death.
Nearly all of those close to Foster expressed shock after hearing the news of his suicide, stating he was the last person they would expect to do such a thing. After interviewing friends and family, Time magazine noted that no one called it a depression. However, in the days which followed, many of Foster's associates would quickly change their stories or refuse to talk.
Mrs. Foster, she won't talk at all. She won't talk to anybody. I called her up when the question came up, was he right-handed or left-handed? Nobody knew. Couldn't find anybody that knew. Well, I asked Mrs. Foster. So I got her on the phone, and I introduced myself, and I said, I just have one question for you. Was your husband right or left-handed? She said, no comment, and hung up the phone.
The Park Police officers involved at the crime scene and also involved in the subsequent investigation have all been ordered to keep their mouths shut, not talk about this case, or they will jeopardize their careers. And this has come down from very high level at the very top of the Park Police chain of command.
Another person interviewed by Reed Irvine was Deborah Gorham, Foster's secretary.
I said, are you under any pressure not to talk? She said, no comment. I said, well, I noticed that you haven't denied it. She said, I didn't even hear the question. Now, to me, that spoke volumes, because I think, obviously, she is under pressure.
Not a single policeman involved in this case from the Park Police or the Virginia law enforcement people believed that this was a suicide. Superiors of the police officers in the Park Police called it a suicide and ordered their people to write this up as a suicide.
Was Foster suicidal? Was he depressed? And this is one of the most suspicious things about the whole scenario that has been accepted by the investigators. The initial reaction to this was absolutely not. He was perfectly normal. His secretary said she'd seen nothing unusual. The people in the office had seen nothing unusual. Bill Clinton had seen nothing unusual.
Much of the Fisk report is devoted to Foster's state of mind prior to his death. Among the evidence that Fisk cites as being indicative that Foster was suicidal was that he organized his desk at work. He paid some bills at his wife's request. He appeared stiff while standing in the kitchen, according to his wife, and he appeared distracted in a meeting, according to Bernard Nussbaum. This last statement is a reversal of an earlier statement made by Nussbaum, where he described Foster's behavior as upbeat. While none of these so-called pieces of evidence would indicate Foster was suicidal, he did receive a prescription for trazodone from his family doctor just before his death.
The doctors I talked to said, well, in the amount, what he took one tablet. He said that's a sleeping tablet, nothing more. Maybe he was having trouble sleeping or something like that. Everybody that suddenly falls in line, he was depressed. The definition of depression is that you have to be in a state of 6 months where you can't do anything. You don't feel like eating, you don't feel like working, you don't feel like going out of the house. And certainly that didn't characterize Vincent Foster.
We had opportunity to ask certain questions, but not anything at length. And we were told, asked, was there anything did you see this forthcoming? Was there anything different about him? Has he been depressed? And all the answers were no.
Makes me wonder whether if I had called him, I could have picked up a clue. I just don't have any way of knowing.
Supposedly he had been in depression, or so we're told, for a considerable period of time. Were you ever aware of that? Did you have any clue what was going on?
No, and neither did people who, spent the weekend with him or saw him in the office that day.
Indeed, everything would indicate Foster was anything but suicidal on the morning of his death. He drove his son and daughter to work. There were no last words of love to his family, no final preparations made. He arrived to work on time, worked conscientiously, set up future appointments, ate lunch, and read the newspaper. He checked out a White House pager prior to leaving and told Nussbaum's secretary he would return later that afternoon. Most importantly, he wrote no suicide note, despite the White House's claim they had suddenly found one.
On July 27, 1993, White House officials revealed that on July 26 they found a note supposedly written by Vince Foster in the bottom of his briefcase.
But it was not a suicide note. Nothing in about, farewell, I'm sorry to have to do this and leave my beloved wife and children and so on. But here are some of the things you'll find my will or anything like that. No preparations like that at all had been made. And yet it's passed off as evidence of a suicide.
They said they had missed the note in the first 2 searches. They went through all this stuff 2 times, and then the third time they said they found 27 pieces of paper in the bottom of his briefcase.
How they could claim that they had overlooked the note during the first examination of the briefcase is ludicrous. You know, you're not searching a warehouse, you're searching a briefcase. And all you do to search a briefcase is turn it upside down and everything falls out.
Steve Newworth allegedly found the note torn into 27 pieces, 1 piece missing, a place where if there had been a signature, there might have been a signature. No fingerprints on it. You know, somebody tore that thing up into 28 pieces and didn't leave any fingerprints. They must have been wearing gloves when they tore it up. Kind of hot in July. I don't know why they'd be wearing gloves to tear it up, but anyway, that's very, very strange.
One of the easiest things in the world to obtain sharp fingerprints from is a piece of paper. Even the old-fashioned way of iodine fumers will bring it out, even in layers, and one fingerprint on top of another. And I defy anyone to tear a piece of paper into 27 pieces without using gloves, without leaving their fingerprints on it, and yet they claim there were no fingerprints on this piece of paper that was torn into 27 pieces. It's idiotic and it's a lie.
The fact of the matter is, this report has so many holes in it, you could drive a truck through it, and it isn't worth much of the paper that it's written on. And yet the media of this country has said, this is a very thorough report. It eliminates any doubt that Mr. Foster was killed someplace else, and it proves that it was a suicide.
The Fisk report we have here today is a superficial document that says a lot more about the White House and about Robert Fisk than it does Vince Foster. The American people deserve better.
The Fisk report actually was a rather huge document that they issued on June 30th, and it had a couple of hundred pages to it. When you open it up, you find out that the actual report of the investigation was only 58 pages. Almost double that number, over 100 pages in the report, were medical resumes.
The pathologists whose bios and resumes made up the bulk of the Fisk report had nothing to do with the examination of Foster and never even viewed the body.
Have you ever visited Fort Marcy Park?
No, sir.
Were you present at the Foster autopsy?
No, sir.
Have you actually examined the gun which was identified as a suicide weapon?
No, sir.
The one resume which truly mattered, that of Dr. Beyer, the pathologist who performed the autopsy on Foster, was suspiciously absent. A possible reason could be because 2 of Beyer's recent suicide rulings were later changed when it was revealed he purposely or accidentally missed critical evidence which pointed to homicide.
Why did Mr. Fisk's pathologists in the Vince Foster case base so much, if not all, of their findings in their report on the conclusions of a medical examiner who has been challenged not once but twice in the last 3 years for flawed autopsies and flawed reports?
One of the pieces of evidence that would tell us whether that autopsy report is accurate or not are x-rays, because they would show where the exit wound was in Foster's head and the nature of the wound and the trajectory of the wound to see if he actually had likely fired the gun himself. The autopsy report says, yes, x-rays were made. It's checked off. The Park Police report quotes the medical examiner as saying that he reviewed the x-rays and there was no evidence of metal fragments left in Foster's head. It was quite surprising to read the Fisk report to learn that indeed the x-rays were never taken, according to the Fisk report, because the medical examiner said that the machine in the medical examiner's office was broken.
Your autopsy report says you took x-rays of Mr. Foster, did you?
No, sir.
The Park Police said you told them an x-ray was taken and told them the results. How do you account for the contradiction?
I have no explanation because I did not take an x-ray.
Well, how did you tell the Park Police the results of an x-ray that you didn't take?
I don't recall telling them that statement.
Well, they do.
Well, I have no explanation.
This 76-year-old pathologist who has a history of calling murders suicides in the past has made some very inconsistent statements concerning whether Vince Foster's head was x-rayed.
I found the technician who had put in the x-ray equipment who told me that this was new equipment that had been installed in June of 1993, and that the first service call they got on it was in October of 1993. Now, Vincent Foster was killed or committed suicide on July 20th, so it seemed that the equipment was in perfect working order from the time it was installed until October, when it was simply a minor adjustment that they wanted. So obviously the people out there had been lying about the equipment being broken.
The equipment was not working, and I saw no need to take an x-ray.
You saw no need to take an x-ray?
No, sir.
Subsequent inquiries to the manufacturers of that piece of x-ray equipment said it was working perfectly before that and was working perfectly after that, and it did not have to be replaced or repaired. So somebody's lying.
Has Robert Fisk ever talked with you?
No, sir.
Robert Fisk has never talked to you?
No, sir.
If Robert Fisk had been serious in re-investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of Vince Foster and the questions concerning x-rays and bullet fragments and pieces of the brain being missing and so forth, one of the first things he would have done, should have done, would have been to obtain a court order and exhume the body and have a re-examination, re-autopsy of the body. And that could still be done. And to me, the failure to do it is a major sign of cover-up.
For some inexplicable reason, Fisk did not use his subpoena power on the Foster case. This is absolutely critical. William F. Romer, who is the highest decorated former FBI agent in the history of the Bureau, was shocked and surprised. He said to me, and it was quoted in one of my reports, that something can be inferred from that, and that if you don't use your subpoena power and impaneling the grand jury, that you could come up with a very different result, and you may not come to the truth.
One of the biggest mistakes, and I don't think it was a mistake, I think it was intentional, acts that was committed by the special counsel was a failure to convene a federal grand jury and subpoena these people and place them under oath with the specter of prosecution for perjury if they didn't tell all. He gave them a license to be vague or to lie because of no threat.
One of the most ominous of all inconsistencies involves Bill Clinton's conflicting versions of his final conversation with Foster. When first asked, Clinton said he couldn't remember when he last spoke with Foster or what was discussed. When he was asked a second time, he claimed he spoke with Foster Sunday night, 2 days before his death. Clinton redrafted his story a third time, changing the date of his call to Monday, the night before Foster's death. According to Time magazine, at this point, Clinton still maintained he was unaware of Foster's depression. When the White House press office announced depression as the reason behind Foster's suicide, Clinton then redrafted a fourth version, claiming the purpose of this call was to cheer up his friend. The question becomes not if Clinton lied, but why he lied. Within minutes of the verification of Foster's identity, the Park Police issued orders to seal Foster's office at the White House. David Watkins, Clinton's administrative assistant, assured the police he would take care of it. He lied.
Instead of sealing Foster's office, you asked Watkins to do it. Now, it is my understanding you called Watkins the night of Foster's death and asked him to do this, and he said he would.
As I said, before I left the notification scene, I asked for him to ensure that that was done.
But he didn't.
Immediately, high-ranking members of Bill and Hillary's staff began ransacking Foster's office, removing important and possibly incriminating documents. The people entering the office included Bernard Nussbaum, counsel to the president, Patsy Thomason, White House Administration Director, and former assistant to cocaine distributor Dan Lassiter, and Margaret Williams, Hillary Clinton's chief of staff.
Why was the office not sealed until 11 a.m. the next morning? Did Bernie Nussbaum, Patsy Thomason, and Maggie Williams know about the order not to go in there because it was supposed to be sealed? And how did they learn in the first place about Vince Foster's death? Did somebody order Nussbaum, Thomason, and Williams to search Vince Foster's office? Or did one of them make the decision to search the office?
The first thing that any agency conducting an investigation of a man in that position should have done is seal his car, seal his office, and seal his home until a thorough search was made. People went in and ransacked his office, absconded with documents, which is a felony to interfere in the conduct of a federal investigation, even an incompetent one. And no one seems to care.
The Park Police were not allowed access to those papers. The FBI was not allowed access to those papers. The Secret Service was not allowed access to those papers. Instead, 8 or 9 attorneys on the White House personnel went in ahead.
And those people should be brought to task for it. And they should be subpoenaed, put under oath, and with the threat of prosecution of tampering with a crime scene, they should be forced to explain why they did it, who ordered them to do it, and what they did with the evidence.
On April 22, 1994, Hillary Clinton stated she had no knowledge of the raid on Foster's office.
Why did your chief of staff, Maggie Williams, why was she not know to remove the documents from his office within days of death?
I don't think that she did remove any documents.
At the Whitewater hearings, Margaret Williams stated under oath that Hillary had ordered her to bring files taken from Foster's office that night to her. Either Williams is guilty of perjury, or Hillary is guilty of obstruction of justice, as well as lying to the American people.
On Mrs. Clinton's instructions, I believe, she took them to the private quarters, the Clinton's quarters at the White House, where they were kept for safety. And if it was done on Mrs. Clinton's orders, that could involve her in the obstruction of justice.
Now, 2 days later, evidently they didn't get everything out of there they wanted, because on July 22nd, 1993, Mr. Nussbaum and other White House officials went into Mr. Foster's office a second time. The FBI agents and the Park Police were ordered to sit on chairs out in the hall while the White House staff went through these documents. And Mr. Nussbaum gave the FBI and the Park Police no indication of what he was taking. One FBI agent stood up to look in the room, and he was reprimanded and told to sit down.
Again, I just want to, we didn't search. Again, we're told to sit down, and I'm not sure how many people were there, 8 to 11 maybe, White House personnel, who searched the office for reasons of national security, I guess, and decided what would be able for us to be looked at. And then that material was turned over to the family attorney. And after he had it for a day or so, then we were allowed to look at it.
The raid on Foster's office was kept secret for 5 months until the Washington Times broke the story in December of 1993. The White House then announced that Whitewater files had been taken from Foster's office. The White House had intentionally directed the media's and the public's attention towards Whitewater, an area the Clintons felt they could handle.
When this is all over, it's going to be the same story we've been telling for 2 years. We made a bad investment, we lost money, and there's really not much more to add to it.
At the same time, the attention was diverted away from more serious secrets, which Foster's office may have held.
I believe they were frightened to death that if a proper investigation was conducted, it would disclose improper actions of people in the White House back in Arkansas, events that Vince Foster had knowledge of, and the White House may have participated in a cover-up of its own, separate from the murder, simply to keep a series of nasty events involving laundered money and covert operations down in Mena, Arkansas, from becoming public. The Arkansas National Guard, when Bill Clinton was governor, was deeply involved in covert operations down in Mena, Arkansas, and Bill Clinton was their commander. And there is strong indications that some of the laundered money from these covert operations wound up being laundered through the Arkansas Treasury and through ADFA. And Vince Foster would have been close enough to that as the confidant of the president that the trail of the motive for someone killing him would have probably led back to Little Rock.
The raid on Foster's office and the ensuing Whitewater scandal led to calls for a special prosecutor to investigate. Robert Fisk was chosen, although his previous ties to Clinton were never made public.
Robert Fisk law firm represented the company that sold the land to Bill Clinton's Whitewater partnership. What's more, Robert Fisk also worked with President Clinton's lawyer in the Paula Jones sexual harassment case, Robert Bennett. They worked together in a case involving the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, also known as BCCI. BCCI was a scandal-plagued $10 billion bank failure that has been implemented and alleged wrongdoing involving the Arkansas phase of Whitewater, which Robert Fisk has banned us from even talking about here today.
Fisk proceeded to collect massive volumes of testimony and documents, making sure the public was never made aware of their content. Meanwhile, the Rose law firm in Arkansas was busy shredding Vince Foster's files.
Jeremy Hedges, a part-time courier at the Rose law firm, told a grand jury that he was told to shred documents from the files of Vince Foster after Special Prosecutor Robert Fisk had announced he would look into Foster's death. That's impeding justice. Wouldn't Vince Foster's former colleagues at the firm want to cooperate in every way with an investigation into their friend's death? Wouldn't Bill and Hillary want to?
Can you tell us what you know about stories about shredding of Whitewater documents down in Arkansas?
Nothing.
At the gubernatorial mansion?
Oh, that didn't happen, and I know nothing about any other such stories.
You don't know about documents related to Whitewater ever shredded anywhere that you know about or authorized or didn't authorize?
Absolutely not.
The American people's outrage over the escalating cover-ups resulted in Washington, D.C. being inundated with calls to hold congressional hearings. Every possible attempt to block or delay the hearings was made. Finally, they were allowed to go forward on the condition that no relevant information be presented to the American people.
The gentleman is really out of order. He's outside of the scope of this inquiry.
Well, Mr. Chairman, if we're going to get the truth of things, we have to be able to ask questions. I don't think I'm out of the scope. We're here to search for the truth, and Mr. Nussbaum has a job to do, and we've got a job to do, and quite frankly, that gavel's not allowing us to do our job.
Well,
so I would repeat my question, saying, is it possible that Mr. Foster had documents in this office regarding Madison Guaranteed Whitewater or Clinton's rule?
The chair has advised the witnesses that they do not have to respond to questions that are outside the scope of this hearing. The gentleman's question is, inasmuch as I have explained repeatedly, that this has to do with observing the integrity of the ongoing unfinished investigation of that portion of the Washington investigation of Mr. Fisk's tour.
Mr. Chairman, you heard before where Mr. Nussbaum says, I've got a job to do, and I said, I've got a job to do. My job is to the American taxpayers.
Well, yes,
I mean, there were 60 million, if I may be permitted, there were $60 million that were lost in Madison.
Well, the gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman,
and the gentleman is not unique in being the only one that's charged with discharging his duty. Every one of us is.
That's not fair.
Well, the gentleman is out of order.
Allowing us to do our job.
His time has expired. He's out of order, and the chair must proceed.
These hearings begin with the investigation of Vincent Foster's suicide, and that should turn the stomach of any caring American.
Somehow, here is the United States Senate giving credence to the most insulting, degrading, lurid, and lunatic theories that people could invent.
The Park Police, the FBI, the medical examiners, the independent counsel, they're all professionals, and they did their job and concluded that Vince Foster did indeed commit suicide. It's sad and tragic, but we should let his family celebrate his many accomplishments and not dwell on the circumstances of his death. And I agree with Senator Dodd that it does indeed border on the macabre.
I hope we can all agree that there's no place in this hearing room for lurid speculation about the tragic circumstances surrounding the suicide of Vincent Foster. The independent counsel has spoken on this issue. The Justice Department and the Park Police have concurred.
The exploitation of Vincent Foster's death by those who want to hurt this presidency is one of the saddest chapters in our recent political history.
There is absolutely no credible evidence to contradict the Fisk report's conclusion that Vincent Foster took his own life and that it happened at Fort Marcy Park.
Despite the intentional omission and cover-up of evidence supporting homicide, the Fisk report was unanimously praised by not only the national media, but by the White House, the Department of Justice, and nearly all members of Congress. It appears now the level of corruption in the federal government has reached unprecedented heights.
I would think that the American public would become a little incensed at a tendency of the national media to assist in cover-ups of this type of thing instead of just accepting them at face value. The national media has made extraordinary efforts to downplay this investigation of Vince Foster and to accept this ludicrous Fisk report.
And I'd like to say to any media that might be paying attention, why aren't you asking these questions instead of just taking this thing at face value?
The national media is so controlled in the United States. They are wimps who go along with the power structure of the country and assist in cover-ups by acts of omission and failing to do their duty. And when they accepted the Fisk report at face value, when it's so blatantly inconsistent with the facts.
On the same day as the release of the Fisk report, Bill Clinton signed into law the reauthorization of the Independent Counsel Act in hopes of retaining the services of Robert Fisk. In signing it, he referred to the act as a foundation stone for the trust between the government and our citizens. Clinton's plan, however, may have backfired. Robert Fisk was fired August 5, 1994, and replaced by Kenneth Starr. In the historic November 1994 elections, the American people, weary of the cover-ups, voted the Republicans into office in Washington, hoping to see justice prevail. Their victory, however, was short-lived. Republican Senator D'Amato from New York, who had promised that full, unrestricted hearings would begin within the first 100 days of the new Congress, went back on his promise.
The American public has a clear and pressing right to know how Foster died and the circumstances of the death and the possible motivation for either a suicide or potentially a homicide.
If it was a close friend of mine, I would have every rock turned over in Washington, D.C. to get the truth out. Bill Clinton just shrugged his shoulders and said, well, we regret that it happened and we won't know why he killed himself. Well, why don't they look?
It doesn't make any sense to me. I hope it doesn't make any sense to my colleague. You know, Lincoln said, let the people know the facts and the country will be saved. How about a few facts on this?
But when the heat of controversy swarms around you, the inner conviction that you did the right thing will be the best salve and the best sleeping medicine.